Okay, we're talking today about two views of distributive justice, and we're talking about contrasting views by two very famous philosophers, both from Harvard, John Rawls and Robert Nozick. Now, what is distributive justice? There's this technical definition here, but the simple definition is what is the just, fair way to distribute the goods of society, including wealth and material goods and also positions and offices and so forth. What is the fair way that things should be distributed? Here's the technical definition. Distributive justice involves the principles of justice dealing with the political processes and socioeconomic structures that affect the distribution of benefits and burdens in societies. In other words, what's the just way to distribute benefits and burdens in society? Let's start with the view of John Rawls. He was a famous political philosopher at Harvard. In fact, his book in 1971, A Theory of Justice, is probably the most widely read, widely discussed, important book of political philosophy, maybe in the 20th century, at least in the English-speaking world. And here's his big idea. His big idea that justice involves fairness, right? Here's how he says it. The principles of justice are the principles that free and rational persons who are concerned to further their own interests would accept in an initial position of equality. In other words, just principles of distribution would be the principles that we would all agree to if we were all in a position of an equal bargaining position in the beginning. So we're all looking out for ourselves. We all sit down at the table and think, what's the right way to divvy up the goods? And whatever we would all agree to, those are the principles of justice. Now, he's part of what you call the social contract tradition. This is a tradition in political philosophy that you can trace back to Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and perhaps in a somewhat different way, but related to Rawls, Immanuel Kant. And the social contract tradition basically says, yeah, justice involves what we would all agree to, the contract that society would make from some initial position of equality, maybe from the state of nature. That's how they used to say it in the old days. And John Rawls is kind of giving us a sophisticated version of that. Well, if the principles of justice are the principles that we would all agree to and we would all accept in an initial position of equality, what would that initial position of equality be like? And Rawls asks us to think about it as the original position. Okay, what is this original position? Well, first of all, it's not a historical situation. This isn't a position that anyone was actually ever in. It's not a state of nature that, at the dawn of time we were all equal and we were in the woods together. Here's what we all agreed upon. No, that's not what he's saying. It's a hypothetical scenario. He's asking us to imagine the kind of scenario in which we would all be equal at the bargaining table. And he says, if you're thinking about a position of equality where we were all equal at the bargaining table, that would be a position in which no one was thinking about their own particular position in the society. In other words, everyone is behind a veil of ignorance, he calls it. So imagine that you don't know what your place in society is or will be. You don't know what social class you're part of. You don't even know what your natural abilities are. You don't know if you're good at math or good at football or anything. You don't know how intelligent you're going to be. You don't know how physically strong you'll be. You don't know if you'll be a man or a woman, white, black, brown, or yellow. You don't even know what your own idea of the good life will be. Are you the kind of person, are you going to be the kind of person who, loves to dance or loves art? Or are you going to be the kind of person who, really loves totally different things? In this initial position, that behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know anything about the self that you will be in society. Now, why should we imagine ourselves in this kind of totally unreal scenario where we don't know anything about ourselves? Well, because when we imagine ourselves in that initial original position, that would be a fair situation in which to agree on social arrangements. If you don't know whether you're going to be a man or woman in society, then you won't make a rule which privileges men over women or women over men, because that might end up hurting you. If you don't know whether you're going to be rich or poor, you won't agree to an arrangement which privileges the rich over the poor over the rich, because you might be one of those. Because you don't know anything about yourself in the original position, you won't agree on a social arrangement which privileges any particular kind of person, because that might end up hurting you. So by imagining ourselves in this original position, we engage in this thought experiment, which allows us to think about what would truly equal social arrangements be like. Now, here's the big question. What principles of justice would we agree to from that kind of original position behind the veil of ignorance? And Rawls thinks, here's a couple principles which we would all agree to. The first principle, he says, that we would all agree to in that original position is a principle of equal rights. We would agree that each person should have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of basic liberties that's compatible with other people having the same liberties. In other words, we'd want everyone to be as free as possible because we'd want ourselves to be as free as possible, and we wouldn't know which position we would have in society. So we would just make a blanket rule, everybody should have these equal rights. Okay. Now, another and more controversial principle that he thinks that we would agree to involves socioeconomic inequalities. In other words, inequalities in our economic situation, how much money we have, what kind of jobs we have, and the social arrangements, which kind of class do we belong to, which kind of group are we in with, which social position do we have. He thinks that if we're behind the veil of ignorance, here's how we would arrange socioeconomic inequalities. We'd want them to be arranged so that those inequalities are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices that are open to all. Let me unpack both of those a little bit. First of all, let me start with the second one first, because that's easiest. The second part says we'd want socioeconomic inequalities to be attached to positions and offices open to all. So in other words, if the CEO of a big corporation is a position that makes a lot more money and has a higher social class, we'd want everybody to have an equal opportunity to be the CEO. Why? Because we'd want to be the CEO, and but we don't know what position we're going to have in society. So we wouldn't want CEO candidates to be limited to one particular race or one particular gender, because we might be excluding ourselves from it. So we want equal opportunity. Now, equal rights and equal opportunity are American principles on which there's pretty wide agreement. The most perhaps controversial part of Rawls' system is the second part of, or rather the first part, part A of his second principle of justice, which we can call the difference principle. The difference principle has to do with how wealth and benefits are distributed in society. And it says that a distribution is just if, and only if, it maximally benefits the least advantaged class in society. Now, why would we agree to that behind the veil of ignorance? Because we might end up being the least advantaged class in society, and we want a system which is going to maximally benefit ourselves, but we don't know which class we're going to be in. So we would all agree to the difference principle, says Rawls. Now, what's interesting about the difference principle is that that's going to result in extensive wealth redistribution by society or by the government. In other words, this is going to require that we take money and goods from the very wealthy and give them to those who are the least well off. Now, when you hear that, redistribution of wealth, you might be thinking, isn't that communism or socialism? And the answer is, well, Rawls is not a communist or a socialist. He's not saying that we should all be totally equal. He is saying that we need a distribution that's going to maximally benefit the least. So let me contrast a couple different schemes. Okay, let's say that this is a society with a totally free market, and it's just open capitalism, and the government never taxes the rich to give it to the poor. Okay, that's going to result, let's say, in vast inequality of wealth. So here's the people in our society. Richie Rich has tons of money, more than twice as much as the next class people. Middle class Marvin and middle class Martha, they both got, they're doing okay. But then there's dirt poor Donnie, and he's only got a tiny little bit. So there's vast inequality between, say, what Richie's got and what Donnie's got. All right, now, Rawls is not okay with this because he thinks we need a distribution that's going to maximally benefit the least well off. Well, you might think that one solution to that was government-enforced total equality of wealth. Let's say that's what communism is. Total equality. So we take, anytime Richie is making more money than the rest of us, we take it and we distribute it to everybody else. Same with everybody. Whoever's making more money, we take and give it to the poor. Well, here's what that produces. Because there's no longer any incentive for Richie to make any more money than anybody else, or for middle class Marvin or Martha to make more money, because they're going to get the same outcome no matter what they do, they don't work that hard and they don't put in any extra effort or innovation. And that hurts the whole economy, right? So everybody is worse off under that because nobody's got a motive to work very hard. So under that situation, maybe Donnie is doing a little bit better than before, right? But nobody's doing that well because they're disincentivized to work. Now, Rawls is not in favor of this either. He's not saying government-enforced total equality is best for Donnie. He says there's an even better scenario for Donnie. What we want is some kind of distribution principle that still rewards innovation and hard work, so that helps the whole economy if we reward innovation and hard work, but where Donnie is still doing better. So the best scenario is where we take some of Richie's money and we redistribute it to Donnie. But we don't take all of Richie's money. We still leave him with a big advantage over everybody else, because if we took it all away, then he wouldn't want to work anymore, and our whole economy would tank. So this is a crude picture of a kind of Rawlsian scenario where Donnie is doing better than he would under any of the previous scenarios. He's doing better than when there was no redistribution because we took some of Richie's money and gave it to him. But he's also doing better than under the straight equality system because this is an economic system which rewards hard work and where all the boats do rise on the rising tide somewhat. In other words, it is redistribution of wealth. It's extensive redistribution of wealth, but it's not some kind of flat rate, everybody gets the same thing. This is where Donnie is better off, and so this is, according to Rawls, what we would agree to behind the veil of ignorance in the original position. If you're thinking about kind of contemporary political left-right dichotomies, I don't think it's inaccurate to say that this is more in line with probably how those on the political left would think. It's not socialism, really, I don't think. It's certainly not communism, but it does involve some limits on the totally free market, and it does involve some redistribution of wealth. Now, for a totally different view, we will look at Robert Nozick in our next video.